Welcome. This is the Need to Heed podcast with Jake Lynch.
And Fernando Davila.
Yep. This week's episode is called Solutions Through Education. A very important episode we have here, especially after last week's mega episode.
Yep. So
last
week we had a first ever team podcast that included all three of our separate podcasts, as well as other members of our team that will soon be starting their own podcast. So it was a very unique situation. Hopefully we'll try and do it again soon. But you guys let us know how you guys enjoyed that. And it was about a lot of stuff, specifically education and classes and workshops that we've all been through to help us with Mindful Me. And today's kind of piggybacking off of what we did last week. So Jake, if you want to explain a little more of this week's.
So essentially, what happened last week is we had a huge discussion about teaching people about mindfulness. And it kind of inspired Fernando and I to have this very podcast where we get to talk about not only education that pushes forward mindfulness, but also education that tackles the problems we're seeing today in society, including that of systematic racism. This is going to be a very delicate topic for this podcast, but as people that have an option to have a voice, Fernando and I feel like it's important to be able to use it, whether we're reaching many people or not at this point. For those of you that are listening, we want to be able to impact people.
Of course.
So yes, this is a very important topic, and the topic is education. How can we find solutions through education, keeping on theme with how we name our episodes, solutions through education? It is important because it provides a peaceful means to an end and a way to solve some of the world's most serious problems. Systematic racism and discrimination are still very prevalent in today's society, as well as the aftermath and the way that it impacts how we treat each other. We can also use mental health help through mindfulness classes through schools, which is something we're going to talk about some studies and how those studies indicated how mindfulness in schools can not only help with individuals and their mental health, but also how we can use that mindfulness to help when it comes to what's happening in today's society in terms of racism, and help with the empathy and being able to understand somebody else's point of view and experiences. So without further ado, we go on to our first topic, having to do with education and the racism that today people are experiencing. Here's what can be done to help combat racism. One of the things that people don't realize is that we often, as students in school, don't talk much about the experiences of Black people in our community, including other minorities. And we don't talk about them other than, for example, Black History Month. Teaching about Black lives when it isn't Black History Month is a huge thing to be able to do. And other strategies from a teacher and educator standpoint who facilitates conversations about race. We have to get more comfortable with talking to each other about race. What is race? Talking about identity and not being colorblind. A lot of people believe that it's important to not see race, but in reality, you're supposed to confront race head on. It's supposed to be something that we're all comfortable with being uncomfortable with. Right now, it could take some time to be able to talk to people about how they experience race, how race has impacted them, but it's important to acknowledge that it's there. And that will be the only true way to eliminate racism, is that if we recognize that there are different cultures and races, but they are all valued the same.
Of course.
Yeah.
And
so
back a little bit off of what Jake was saying, and I'm sure you're not talking about it right now, is the way we teach racism in schools and stuff like that should also change. Not just the time of when we should talk about it. Obviously, it should be talked about all the time, not just for 1 month, but how they teach it.
Of course, yeah. So what? Yeah, exactly what I was about to talk about was that often in today's schooling, children are taught that racism is a historical event. It's something that happened a long time ago that people fought to fix, and then it was fixed through laws, and everybody's equal now. But in reality, systematic racism and discrimination are still occurring events, right? And this can be changed not only through how we're taught about racism in schooling, it shouldn't be taught as a historical event, but a prevailing topic, but also that children of different races are taught from an early age about race very differently. You know, children of races that are discriminated against are taught from an early age how to proceed and caution when confronted by the police, and are taught essentially that there is no reason to be afraid in those situations, but that they should carry on in a way where they need to be cautious. You know, people, Black children and children of other minorities are taught from an early age that they have to proceed with caution because they are looked at differently. You know, white children opposed to that are not taught from an early age how to handle these situations because they're not going to be confronted with it. You know, whiter children and children in other situations are taught that the police are your protectors, while people of different uh, cultures and different races are taught that they need to be careful when in the presence of a police officer or pulled over. Because in reality, there is always the possibility of a danger simply because of their race. So that needs to change. Is that white children from an early age need to be able to understand the fear and what is happening to their fellow citizens and peers of different races. They need to be able to understand what's happening to them and the fear that they experience.
Exactly. And that's like the first thing that's gonna cause change and like actually fix the problem is once everyone fully understands what other people go through and opening and seeing other perspectives is when change will actually start.
Yeah, there needs to be a sense of empathy and sympathy. Uh, Also, it's important for our listeners and everybody else to know that we are not taking a stance against police or trying to make a conclusion about all police, because
At all.
obviously there are good police officers,
Of course.
but it is to be known that there can be bad police officers.
Of course. And no, obviously it's like with everything, there's good of everything, there's bad of everything. You can't put everything into one category for anything.
Of course. So, with that being said, we need to recognize the fact that systematic racism is a reality and a crisis and should be treated as such. But we can't treat this with no hope. Obviously, there are people that are currently taking action through protests and trying to educate people through social media. This is one of the ways where this podcast is one of the ways that Fernando and I are trying to take place and spreading that education. But the hope that we need to have is to know that this problem is solvable through education and explanations. You have to encourage questions. You have to encourage questions about race. As a white person or a person of any creed, as a Black person, as an Hispanic, as Fernando and I are, you need to be able to ask other people how race impacts them to better understand what their life is like based off of how they are looked at. So this is very important to be able to approach this as a peaceful way, as a peaceful way to understand how people live, and there's no problem in asking somebody what their experiences are, how they've lived their life, and how they feel like it's impacted them.
And before we continue, we also want to make it clear that we're not saying that racism just goes one way. Racism goes in all directions, obviously. So we're just really trying to elaborate on the fact that racism, no matter which way it is, still exists and still needs to be explained and taught through school to obviously eventually solve the problem.
Yes. Another huge thing I think is admitting your mistakes. You know, as a white person in this country, you can make a mistake when it comes to profiling someone, and you can go the other way around in any community. But as long as you're able to admit that mistake
And learn from it,
and learn from it, you can fix it. Stubbornness is not the answer,
of course.
and mistakes based on ignorance can be forgiven as long as one acknowledges the mistakes and continues to fix future habits.
Yeah.
I think a large problem of the continuing racism is that people feel like they've lived a certain way their entire lives and have no other option but to continue living that way, because if not, they're in some way uh, devaluing what they've done through with their time and through their efforts. But in reality, you can learn and you can be forgiven for things that you didn't know, or for trying to educate yourself. If you go out and you know you've made the mistake, you can be forgiven, which is a big thing to remember.
Yes. So, Jake, if you're done with that specific section, I'm going to move on to the benefits of incorporating mindfulness in schools. Like you touched up on it, on how schools can incorporate mindfulness in the sense of racism and that stuff. But honestly, mindfulness should be taught in schools in many different subjects and different areas, not just racism, because school is something that everyone does, no matter if it's one way or another. Mostly all children do go to school, and it helps being mindful specifically in school because it helps you gain attention and focus, which eventually leads to better grades, obviously. Uh, gives you more effective emotional regulations. It helps your behavior in school when you're mindful, when you know how to combat problems in different ways, looking at different perspectives. It helps you understand other people's problems and even your problems better. You have greater empathy and perspective taking, which is what I was just talking about. If you have a problem with someone, a teacher, a classmate, whatever it is, if you can sit there and think, okay, how can I solve this problem one way? Okay, how would he solve the problem? Like just seeing what other people feel will obviously help you throughout the school day. And it's your life skills. You get better social skills. You learn how to talk to people. You learn how to deal with problems better, stuff like that. People skills you really do gain, which is what we were talking about last week in our group podcast. That there's people skills in everything. So if schools, public schools, private schools, charter schools, all types of schools incorporated mindfulness, it would be essentially filling the toolbox that we tried filling last week even more, and it would be a lot more beneficial to all the students. It obviously reduces anxiety and stress from school, tests, and homework, all that type of stuff. You can use mindfulness literally every day, all day. And it also would lower the rate of depression. This country, state, this whole world obviously deals with a lot of depression every day from different types of problems, whether they're social problems, family problems, personal problems. Everyone has anxiety, depression at some stage, maybe not as severe as others, but having mindfulness taught to you at school gives you another tool of dealing with it and helping your everyday life. It helps you reduce your stress from school or from work or from whatever it is that you're doing at home. So it's easy to do and easy to. It's not something that you need too much um, time for. So if you didn't do it during the school day, I know after 2 years ago we started doing some mindfulness. Jake, I'm sure you remember the small little breathing techniques and stuff like that during the school day.
Morning meditations.
The morning meditations, the deep breathings, those all help throughout the day. And unfortunately, it kind of stopped, and we think we should really
Try to
reiterate
get back to it.
and come back to us and actually incorporate it even more in our daily school days. So yeah, it helps you find peace. Obviously, the meditations, the deep breathing that Jade and I were just talking about. It was a great way to start the day because you were stressed or scared that you had a test or you had homework that you didn't do or something, and or any small problem that can cause you to stress. Your deep breathing, your uh, meditations, all that before doing all that work really does help. It's
Yeah,
also, what was that?
I was just gonna say it really helps lower and ground you. You know, brings you back to earth when throughout the day you can be floating off to stress and you can end up becoming more irritable. You can get angrier, but
Exactly.
this can bring you back.
And not even just that, it also helps you give you a life skill that you're going to use in the real world after school. Whatever profession you go to, there will always be stress. There will always be something that's stressing you out or that you need a break from. So, having those mindfulness skills taught to you at an early age is very beneficial for the rest of your life. So, we think that that should obviously be incorporated in school. And it's really broad because obviously different schools have different methods of teaching, even the same class. Math classes are different in all schools. So mindfulness is such a broad subject that just incorporating a little bit of it goes a long way. So, speaking of that, we're just going to talk about how mindfulness can improve education and empathy for others to help resolve social issues. So, I just mentioned to you all the daily issues, but the social issues that we're seeing every day now. Um, those also can be, if everyone was taught mindfulness in an early stage, the social issues would be handled in different ways and different methods that could be more beneficial than they are now.
Yeah, far easier to resolve
Yeah,
if uh, if everybody is taught from an early age empathy and how to see things through other people's perspectives.
so yeah, honestly, that's gonna wrap up really the most of this podcast because, like I said, it's a very broad subject that you can interpret in many different ways and use in different ways. I was just giving some normal, basic examples of stress, depression, anxiety, that type of stuff that can be dealt with mindfulness in everyday schools. But obviously, there's endless to talk about when it comes to using mindfulness in our everyday lives.
Of course. So, without further ado, we want to thank you guys for listening.
Remember that we do have a summit in the works, an online virtual summit due to the whole COVID-19, but it is
Very excited.
we'll hopefully have dates for you in the upcoming week.
Yep. So, thank you from the Need to Heed podcast with Jake Lynch.
And Fernando Davila, and stay tuned for our weekly meditation, newsletters, and more podcasts from the rest of us. Have a good one, guys.
Thank you.